Hello, everyone, and welcome to Tech Talks, our virtual speaker series focused on technology ethics. My name is Elizabeth Ranieris, and I'm the founding director of the Notre Dame IBM Technology Ethics Lab. Along with my colleague Kirsten Martin, director of the Notre Dame Technology Ethics Center, we are very happy to welcome you to our third Tech Talk of this semester in a series focused on technology and power. In this series, we're examining how the speed and breadth of technological advancement often replicates historical and systemic racism, discrimination, and inequalities in employment, education, healthcare, financial services, criminal justice, and virtually every aspect of modern life. We also look at how individuals and entities with the power and resources to develop and deploy new technologies generate massive financial, social, and political capital, while marginalized members of society are often excluded from their benefits or made to bear the brunt of their harms. We are joined by leading academics, practitioners, and activists to explore questions such as who reaps the benefits of new technologies and who suffers the harms or consequences? How is technology reshaping or reinforcing existing power dynamics in society, including with respect to gender and race? And can technology distribute power more equitably, and if so, how? Today, we examine these themes in relation to machine learning, an application of AI that uses data sets and algorithms to teach machines to learn. Machine learning purports to make accurate predictions and decisions about everything from mortgage approvals to cancer diagnoses and even criminal recidivism rates. But time and again, scholars, activists, and journalists have demonstrated that algorithms, machine learning models, and the data used to train them often digitize and replicate historical inaccuracies, prejudices, biases, and institutional harms, and may require more scrutiny as a result. We are delighted to have two experts on these themes with us today. First up, we have Abeba Birhane. Abeba is a PhD candidate in cognitive science at the Complex Software Lab in the School of Computer Science at the University College Dublin in Ireland, and LIRO, the Irish Software Research Center. Her interdisciplinary research examines the indeterminable and ambiguous nature of people as complex adaptive systems and the problems that arise with machine prediction of such systems. Abeba has won numerous awards for her research and reports, including the award for Best Paper at the Conference and Workshop on Neural Information Processing Systems, Black and AI Workshop for her work on relational ethics. Abeba's work has been featured in Time Magazine, the Irish Times, and Venture Beat Magazine, who also named her a top innovator in computer vision. We are also joined by Dr. Noopur Raval. Dr. Raval is a postdoctoral researcher at the AI Now Research Institute at NYU. She has studied the impacts of gig economy platforms on how we work, live, and relate to each other ethically, and examine their effect on labor conditions, collectivization, and the redistribution of social power through platform participation. Her work is focused on the intersection of information science and communication and media studies. Dr. Raval leads a new AI lexicon project at AI Now and is part of the Data Genesis program, which studies the human work and human machine vision required to collect, assemble, and label data for AI and machine learning. Dr. Raval obtained her PhD from the University of California, Irvine, and is a fellow at UC Berkeley Center for Tech, Society, and Policy. Abeba and Noopur, thank you for being here today to discuss machine learning and power. I'll lead us in a discussion for about 30 to 40 minutes, after which we'll turn to questions from our attendees. So for those who are in the Zoom, you can submit questions through the link in the chat. And for those watching the live stream on YouTube, you can submit your questions through the link in the comments. Without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. So since we have a general audience with us typically, let's start with a high level question around what machine learning is, what it's good for, and what it's not so good for, including any common misconceptions. Abeba, would you please walk us through the difference between AI and machine learning and any limits or common misconceptions around machine learning that you'd like to highlight?
Wow. Well, first of all, thank you so much for such a kind introduction. And it's such a pleasure and an honor to be here, with an amazing counterpart, panelists. So thank you so much. And that question, oh my God, can you ask any bigger question? I mean, I can safely say that it's impossible to define artificial intelligence, machine learning, maybe. That's my answer is like, it's difficult, if not impossible to define what AI is, but you can think of machine learning as a subfield of artificial intelligence as, a subcategory. So AI as a broader term in machine learning as one specific type. So with that kind of broad clarification, I guess a misconception of AI, at least for me, is, well, there are so many misconceptions. One is that, the very common misconception is because people often associate AI with, stats or mathematics. People often think, just whatever your model does or whatever your data set, it just represents reality in a neutral and objective way. Even though for people within the AI ethics field, even though this is just a really tired claim, people are just really tired of, it's a misconception that continually persists again and again and again. The other misconceptions, maybe not so much misconception, but a really kind of tiring discourse around AI is the huge, overhype around AI, and people both from within the field and outside the field seem to have this, huge blind faith in AI, that AI can do this, AI can solve this problem or that problem. So people seem, especially now, some experts might say we are in AI spring, the way you have like AI winters, AI springs. So there is so much appetite for buying into all these overhypes around AI, and little appetite to kind of stop and think and criticize and scrutinize and constant scrutiny. At least for us who are who are constantly criticizing, it just comes across as you are just a problem. You're just pointing out problem instead of like solving them or coming up with steps to solving them. So those are my my frustration, at least from my side.
Thank you. We're certainly going to dive into a lot of the things you touched on there. Since that is a really big question, let's turn to Noopur and start with something that we'd hope is a little bit simpler, although we recognize it's probably not in practice. Let's talk about where the data comes from, right? Let's start at the very source of this. Noopur, can you walk us through where the data for machine learning comes from, how it makes its way into data sets and models that are ultimately used in training?
Sure. So again, I feel like Abeba can speak to it more than I can, and I'm still definitely very much getting used to being even sort of marginally an insider to whatever is the AI community, because by training I'm a media studies scholar, and then I went on to do more critical information science kind of work. But yeah, and your question is excellent because it kind of ties my interests in terms of why I work at the intersection of these communities, or what my interest is in AI, broadly speaking. So to answer it very directly and sort of simply, there's different sources of AI data training, depending on what context or what applications we're talking about. It would not be an exaggeration to say that one of the sort of dominant sources of data training and cleaning has typically come from crowd work and crowdsourcing. So if you think about platforms like Amazon's Mechanical Turk, which has for long been this sort of platform where scientists typically, or people working on computer science problems, either have a corpus of data available to them and then need for certain tasks to be performed. So sorry, I'm also going to switch back and forth between science studies and media studies to talk about how there's a notion of expertise that underpins some of the problem articulation and problem solving in machine learning. So it is constantly a back and forth exercise, to my mind, between the more elite workers, so people we typically identify as computer scientists who are already leading research labs, or sort of people with broader visions of what they're trying to achieve in computer vision or in language processing or other kinds of subfields. And then you often also have another sort of group of sub-elite experts, which are often computer science students, who are also deeply involved with doing some of the data cleaning and annotation tasks, depending on how well resourced a lab is or how big or small the scope of a project is. And then finally, you have crowd workers who've been doing this kind of work for a while. And yet another community that I'm increasingly interested in and have been sort of doing some exploratory research around is people working as offshore contracted data workers in, as third-party vendors in offshore facilities, often in the global south, so often in the African continent, in Latin America, and the South Asian subcontinent, definitely. And it's kind of what I see as a continuation of an older call center and business processing kind of outsourcing moment where these kind of tasks were outsourced to the so-called global south because you could find labor for cheaper. And a similar sort of trend and movement has been happening for a while, not just because of labor concerns and wanting cheaper labor, but also because it allows companies, that are, and I think Abeba will come to it later, is how democratizing AI has in itself a huge number of challenges because the kind of computing resources needed to compete in the commercial AI space, right, are available to very few corporations or research labs. And so those corporations and research labs that are also engaged in a sort of intellectual property race and war have tended to gravitate more towards contracting and having confidential data cleaning and annotation facilities that can be constantly engaged in sort of real-time or responsive data cleaning and training to match the needs of AI training of those specific companies or teams and so on.
Thank you, Noopur. Please feel free to jump in.
Yeah, so all those excellent points, I kept thinking the other misconception about AI, which is that people tend to think of AI as, autonomous or fully autonomous, or AI is doing this, AI is doing that. Whereas when you look under the hood, when you dig deep down, you don't even have to dig, down. You don't even have to dig deep down. When you just scratch the surface, what you find is AI is just people through and through. And, the ghost workers and, the mechanical Turks and the click workers that Noopur was describing are, they are a really essential element of the AI pipeline, but often they are just excluded. They are not seen as, as stakeholders or as part of, as part of AI, but their work is crucial for any AI systems to function. So yeah, another misconception, just to add, of that we often think of, AI is doing this by itself as if it's some kind of magic, but it's, from the top scientists, from the, the middle level that Noopur described, all the way down to the data annotators, even the data itself. Why we are having an AI spring, if you want to call it that, now over the last 10 years, especially in computer vision, is because there is, people have the tools to source data from the internet, and there is endless data from the internet, and all that data, whether it's image, text, voice, anything, it comes from people. So it's our data, it's everyone's data, it's people's data that is enabling AI. That has become part of these huge large-scale data sets. So from the data subjects, from the people that are putting up their images or any kind of data up on the internet, to the click workers and ghost workers, all the way up to top scientists, it's AI is people through and through. The only difference is, the lower you go, for example, for ghost workers or even like data subjects. I hesitate to use that term, but I haven't found a better term for now. But people, whose, texts or images or voices have been sourced as data for training and validating AI systems, in most cases, people are not even aware that their data is, their images are in a database, and that it's being used to train and validate AI, and they haven't been asked for consents in most cases, most certainly in vision systems. Yeah, sorry, I'm ranting now.
Now, I know you both have so much expertise to share, and there's so many directions we could take this. I mean, I want to actually hone in a little bit on the terminology and language. So, Noopur, I think we were both at Berkman Klein at some point, and we have a colleague who, wrote fantastic work on ghost workers. And I know there's a lot of terminology used in this context around the type of outsourcing, crowdsourcing you're talking about, sometimes around invisibility, sometimes around ghost work. And Noopur, I think you've actually, written and spoken about this before, kind of the role of language and linguistics in how we categorize and characterize some of this work. You're also working on the new AI lexicon project, and I know that's also really looking at the role of terminology and power dynamics across, geographies and other dimensions. So, how do you view kind of the language we use to describe some of these processes involved in AI and machine learning and the impact they have on power?
Sure. So I'll give two examples to kind of show the outer core of what isn't really a computer science technical problem per se, but has so much to do with how we experience the effects and consequences of what we sort of identify as AI or machine learning in the world, in the real world, right? And that's kind of what informed and inspired the lexicon project, as well as some writing that I've done on challenging the trope or the notion of ghost workers, not because calling them ghost workers is wrong, or that's one way of looking at it, but I try to constantly ask myself as a global South or as a global media scholar, what calling something, or depending on the positionality and the situated context from which we're studying the same problem, I think it offers us very interesting stakes, right? And our stakes can never in that sense be, using Sheila Jasanoff's terms. I'm less invested in positions that are from everywhere or that are from nowhere, but I like locating myself as speaking from somewhere. So the first point, and speaking to the ghost worker terminology and the language, I personally feel like the ways in which it is being used does cater or does invoke a certain way of seeing, right? A way of finding, visibilizing, and looking at, and hence sort of pulling the veil and finding these workers who are working in the so-called back offices of AI. But like I said earlier, this ghost worker trope and sort of the back office of technology thing has long been a trope in global communication studies. And at some level, it's great because it helps us understand that what global North consumers, or what elite experts and elite consumers are used to seeing as an economy of technology, what's going on under the hood. Absolutely, right? Who's really powering, whose human subjective decisions are really powering what we see as the outcomes of technologies. But then I sort of go back and forth and think to myself, how does this play out in a global South setting, such as India, where I grew up, where I've done a lot of my research, right? And what I end up seeing is that technology is actually really ubiquitous. The socio-technical imaginaries of AI are quite different, right? Technological work is so privileged and so dignified compared to a lot of other professions or occupations that are available to people in a context or setting like that. So in that sense, even though it's called low-tech work, be it data cleaning or be it other forms of click work, I want to ask, and I want us to push further and figure out, what is the low doing in low tech work? Are we simply referring to it as a lower or a simpler form of technological work? Or are we also talking about how it is undignified work or exploitative work? And if we want to answer those questions, I think we need to locate them in situated contexts to see why people are choosing to do that kind of work. And then what I found as more interesting questions to ask of Global South data workers, for instance, is actually looking at their creative capacities, looking at how a lot of data workers in the Global South don't just come to data annotation work or other forms of technological work simply using their human faculties or critical faculties. They're in fact asked to perform subjectivities. They're given cultural trainings on what their consumers might think is bias, and hence asked to learn different forms of cultural knowledges to then go back to information systems or databases and say, this is specifically the kind of biases you need to locate, and this is what you need to remove. So there, if you can see, there's already no sort of obvious or universal notions of bias that one can go and simply even find in databases. The construction of bias in itself as a social category is very interesting to me. And to talk briefly about another example that sort of, to me, elucidates the role of language in the construction of concerns in the AI space, is one of the essays that is a part of the lexicon by Aswata Babu, who is a PhD student studying facial recognition technologies in one of the Indian states. And what's interesting is that, also as my colleague Joy Rankin at AI Now has talked about, there's obviously an AI pipeline, right? And so when some of these so-called pure technologies such as facial recognition arrive and get translated into commercial enterprise, there's still a lot of articulation work that has to go in to explaining why this technology is worth paying that much money, right? When vendors approach police departments or public welfare services or whoever needs to buy these services. And so Aswata has looked at the case of how vendors try to sell the same technology essentially to a school compared to a policing context. And since there is no available language to just translate facial recognition into the regional language, which is Tamil, they end up inventing new terms for when facial recognition is used in the schooling context, right? Where the translated term actually highlights the attendance and the positive advantages of using such a technology in a school context versus when they're trying to sell the same technology in a policing context. And the emphasis is obviously on surveillance or other kinds of things that police personnel can do with it. So I find myself constantly fascinated with these kinds of acts of construction and articulation that I feel are overlooked when we talk about AI, data sets, databases, as if they're given, as if they just appear or present themselves to us. Yeah.
So much food for thought and so many things to touch on. I want to stay on this theme because what I'm hearing you saying also about language and terminology is really how much it reveals about values and values underpinning these systems and these methods. So on the point of values, I want to turn back to Abeba and talk about a paper you recently co-authored. And my apologies, I'm forgetting your co-authors, but on the values encoded in machine learning research, where I think you identified 60 or more values across 100 highly cited papers in the field. I'd love for you to tell us a little bit about what you found and what this reveals, not just about what the values are underpinning, research around machine learning, but how this may trickle down into applications and why it matters.
Yeah, so it was a paper we worked on with 5 other collaborators from the Radical AI Network, Resistance AI Now. And it was a really long, very, rigorous and exhausting work that took us over 2 years. And what we did was that we took 100 most influential, top cited papers from two of the, the most, two premier machine learning, two of the top conferences, which are NeurIPS and ICML. And we read through them, we annotated them, we went over and over again, identifying values, reiterating, and in summary, what we found was that we identified 67 values, and what we found was that, at the very top, you have values such as performance, accuracy, state of the art, generalization, which is a term that is not as if as an AI generalizing or a system kind of a tool being applied to various domains. That's not the case for most of these top values. They were defined and operationalized in a very specific, very narrow, very technical way. So when people talk about, say, performance or efficiency, for example, they really are not talking about how efficient systems could, allow low-resource researchers to train models or anything like that. It really is very specific in a way that that just allows a big tech corporation labs and elite university labs to I'm going to use the term efficiency itself, to source data or to train models to anyone who has high compute power to access those resources. So what we found was those really, very narrow, those values only, it's not only that values such as, performance, efficiency, accuracy, and state of the art, it's not that they are the top values, and they are also very narrowly technically defined. Out of the 100 papers we looked at, we also were looking at what's missing. Only 2 papers mention bias and fairness, and one of them just mentions it in passing, and neither of them discuss it in more than a few sentences. And for, these are, the most influential papers. They are, they find some of them are proposing tools, some of them are proposing a new novel theory, some of them are, open sourcing something. So these works are most influential, and they end up influencing other applications, other papers, and the tools end up having been applied somewhere, along the lines. For example, some of the papers were discussing some of the papers were discussing the applications of, say, face swaps. You have, really troubling applications of such technology where people are, it's difficult to mention here, you have deep nodes or other applications where this kind of technology ends up being used to kind of use women's faces or, body parts, images of body parts to then, insert them into a pornographic scene or, other really engrossing, scenarios. So the point I'm trying to make is these such works have wide-reaching implications. So in that light, it's really troubling that ethical implications or fairness or privacy or concerns like this were not raised at all by such papers. And unfortunately, the paper has been rejected again and again, both by ICML and NeurIPS, and we are in the process of submitting it somewhere because I'm going to, I don't want to speak on behalf of all the group, but I have a deep feeling, at least, that critical work like ours, it's not even critical. We are not proposing any value judgments. We are saying here there is general conceptions of what AI researchers value, or where the AI field is going. There is anecdotes, there is various personal testimonies. So what we were trying to do is okay, let's look at actually some of the most influential papers and let's see what they are about. So what we proposed in that paper is not even a critical judgment. We were just looking at the papers and putting forward, here is what top machine learning papers value. Here is what they are underlying. Here is what they strive for. So that's what we just presented. And that wasn't really welcome. And I think that really just shows how, the community, we had really harsh criticisms. And again, I'm speaking personally, this may not represent my co-authors' views, but to me, it just shows that there is so much work to be done, because our work was judged by much harsher criteria than the conference, judges other works. And it's just like, it's a system that is, so we were like getting reviews such as like, your methods don't scale. And we are saying, scale is not necessarily a good thing. And how do you, it's like, it's a problem that's really is an ecological problem where, it's a really, cocooned system where you have to, undo the whole culture, the whole ecology, and you have to, bring so much, cultural awareness to kind of incorporate and make, integrate this kind of work as part of machine learning, because as far as our paper was concerned, the community did not see it as, relevant or, part of machine learning research, which is really unfortunate. But because I think this kind of work is part of machine learning, part of studying machine learning systems. Yeah, that's a long rant about our paper, but the finding was really, really interesting.
Thank you. It is really interesting that you identified so many common values, and yet there were these major ones, as you've pointed out, missing. And I guess, for those of us who've been working in this for a long time, perhaps it doesn't come as a surprise. And yet I do feel that it's a really relevant. I mean, we wish you great luck, obviously, with the paper. I think this point on scale is definitely something I'd like to zoom in on. One of the core themes our lab is focused on is actually the ethics of scale. And it feels like it's coming up time and time again, both in terms of the scale of the conversation, how broad or how narrow, are the questions that we're asking, the size or scale of data sets, used in AI and machine learning, the scope or scale of human involvement, to speak to sort of gig work and crowdsourcing, the human contribution and costs, right, in training machines, and other relevant dimensions of scale. So I'd like to ask each of you what role you think scale plays or should play in the conversation about the ethics of machine learning, and specifically in relation to power. And I'll let you take in either order, so feel free to jump in.
Abeba, would you like to go first? I can go after you.
Yeah, sure. So Alex, Hannah, and a colleague have a great paper that I recommend. It's called Against Scale. It's a really good paper. And I agree with that paper. Scale and, scale and fairness and justice stand on the opposite side of a continuum. So the more you go for the larger and larger scale, the more you are leaving behind those really important values such as justice, context, and welfare of the individual, whether individual that's impacted by AI systems or the data subject or anything like that. So scale is really something that removes us from important values such as like this. And it's also a really kind of recurring theme within the machine learning community. We also have a recent paper with other collaborators where we looked at one of the biggest multimodal datasets, image and text pair datasets. At the beginning, the dataset has 400 million image text pairs, but now it's growing by a minute. So I think there are probably 20 billion image text pair datasets by now. And so it was one of the most emotionally draining, really troubling projects I have ever worked. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't look at some of the images. And looking through the images in text pairs, what we found was that it's just horrendous. Any prompts we put in, any banal really, terms such as big or small or beautiful, none, mommy, anything like that, the data set returned with mostly pornographic images of women. This wasn't the case when you type in, of course, CEO or boss or anything like that. And one of the justifications for this kind of projects is that when the higher, the bigger the scale, it will just balance out all these problems and all these issues. The good and the bad will balance out, and in the end, you will just have a representation of reality. So this kind of thinking is really driven by scale thinking, and as the paper we just put out shows, that really is not the case. And scale doesn't really, cancel out, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And anything sourced from the internet, first of all, does not represent reality. It only represents, images or texts from from a really narrow view, more specifically from the view of, the Western white cisgendered male. So, for example, when we looked at, when we put the prompt Africa, we found a really, cliched images of women with tattoos, and traditional clothing. Some of them are even naked. And we type Europe, you find just like, blank maps or anything like that. So, so the internet really is not just reality. It's just, a version of reality as seen by a really specific, perspective from a certain political, cultural, and personal background and view. Also, we experimented with various angles, typing in, for example, best president and worst president, and it just shows how really conservative and right-wing the dataset's representation is. So in short, scale does not really, balance out, and, just the more scale, the higher scale up and the more data you have, you do not, in fact, you just end up hoarding all the ugliness of the internet rather than balancing it out. So the higher the scale, the more in trouble you are. That's what I think, for sure.
It's a very direct answer. I appreciate it. Noopur, would you like to jump in as well?
Yeah, definitely. And I completely agree on so many counts. And also the paper by Alex, Hannah, and colleagues is just fantastic. I would really encourage everyone to read it. But I'm going to try and, I guess I've thought about it as well. And I think this is an enduring problem in human-computer interaction as well, or people thinking for long about technology design. I guess, there have been some excellent critiques of scale over there as well, including some work by my PhD advisor, Professor Paul Durish. And it makes me wonder what kind of things are being asked or assured of in the name of scale, which I think basically all excellent critiques of scale have kind of laid bare, right? The conceit of scale. And I keep running up against, I guess, an implicit assumption that if it all balances out, it's somehow also then an indication of a democratic process, or in ways that powerful people or privileged people talk about democracies working themselves out. When, as Abeba said, in reality, when that kind of democratic process seems to work itself out, even outside of technological processes, it's often people who already have access, who are people who are already clued into the conversation, right? And we see this happening all the time with access to political rights, access to voting, all kinds of other things and walks of lives. So it definitely also ties back to an enduring problem with the internet in terms of how traditionally, the knowledge layers on which or the cultural memory of the internet that we seem to be drawing on and building on is already so flawed and has relied on or has sort of been representative of where internet access has been more prevalent, who's had also economies of leisure and economies of time, right? Which I'm sure somebody's talked about it, but I feel like it's a point that sort of, we talk about how sexist and white and privileged the internet is in itself, but I feel like it's not just because of a certain kind of participation or bodies that participate, but it's a historical kind of economy of time and leisure when the people who've been allowed access, people who've been seen as the nerds, people who've been seen as, you know, it's okay if young boys who have access to the internet do certain kinds of things on it, has all sort of trickled down, and, you know, we're in some sense reaping the fruits of it. To switch gears and maybe add just a small point to it and point to another essay by Dr. Mehtab Khan, who's also written for the Lexicon project. I think, so myself, I've worked with the Wikimedia Foundation and Wikimedia communities in an earlier moment, in a pre-AI moment, where, and within a global South setting, where the thing that we were all told within a developmental context was that hence we need more representation of our images, our knowledges, you know, our topics, be it sari, textile, weaving, all kinds of different knowledges, and that's eventually going to make the internet more representative in many ways. And this problem has sort of, again, far preceded more computational concerns, right? This was simply about what do you search for on the internet, and hence what kind of a mirror does it show you if you're a young growing person, or if you're somebody trying to look for representative knowledge online. But I think it's found its way into AI debates and AI discourse in a different and weird kind of way, which I think Mehtab has written about and talked about, is that we also forget issues of scale. Yes, there's a certain imperative for scale. And if we started imagining sort of a pro-justice or a specifically anti-racist pedagogy of how do we then start reimagining AI and internet, it still poses challenges for drawing boundaries around how our knowledges must be used. Because when it all goes in the name of scale, you know, if we've given our knowledges to open source databases of images and text, hoping that it's going to develop or you know, develop into more democratic databases or knowledges, that's still not happening. And hence now people have started talking about traditional knowledge licenses and different kinds of licenses that could also draw some sort of boundaries around the speculative or eternal use of different kinds of data through computational or through AI logics, which also adds complications and tends to, you know, skew and pervert the knowledges. So the intention I guess my point to add to the conversations on scale is that there's so many steps at which we need to check for intention and in fact set in place some kind of boundary setting exercises if we really wanted to arrive at a scaled but also democratic form of AI. Yeah.
Thank you, Noopur. Appreciate the contributions. I do want to leave some time for the questions, but I did want to get to just a few other things, if we can, specifically around what some of the more promising approaches or ways forward might be. For example, Abeba, I know you've written and spoken extensively on this idea of relational ethics, and I was hoping that you might educate our audience on what you mean by relational ethics and if it represents a path forward for you.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so the idea behind relational ethics, so as you mentioned at the beginning, my background is in cognitive science. So from cognitive science, I come from a really specific niche area called embodied and inactive cognitive science, also complex systems thinking. So the idea there is that, you know, it's a different radical way of thinking about, you know, human behavior, human actions, cognition, and social systems, in a way kind of pushing back against traditional cognitive science, which assumes or which kind of takes for granted the person as a static, kind of, you know, definable and, really something that we can draw clear boundaries about So my background, this, embodied and inactive and complexity thinking is that, there is no clear boundaries where, cognition doesn't end at the skull and the person doesn't end at the skin, but rather we are relational and we exist in a web of relations. We are interconnected and we are, dynamic and continually moving. And, there is infinite potentials for a person to behave or act in the short term or in the long future. And the idea is that, it's we are indeterminable and, non-finalizable. So any model you make of human behavior or human cognition is always limited because you can only get a snapshot of, that behavior or that action. So the idea is like trying to kind of highlight this ambiguity and messiness and this dynamic change underlying what we think of human beings in social systems. So that way of thinking about cognition in humans in societies, it's the general. I use the general term relational as opposed to rational, which the rational thinking is all about cognition, all about thinking, all about the brain. It kind of equates the person to the brain. So it's a pushback against that. So relational is a pushback against rationality. So the idea of trying to, embed ethics thinking or ethical thinking in that relational domain or in that relational realm is to think of it as, not something of, not something that is, that can be kind of like, you can't have, a definite answer or a clear solution to, this model or this data set, or, you can't predict someone's behavior for sure because of all those underlying factors I mentioned. So the idea behind is that we have to think in terms of whether we are thinking about data sets or cognition or society or people or anything. We have to think in terms of complexity. We have to think in terms of these relations and connections and dynamicity and interdependence and structures, both societal structures, and power asymmetries. So it's a way of trying to kind of zoom out and look at how we think about all these issues in these relational terms, and instead of just focusing or instead of thinking in terms of, say, a fairness equation or some kind of narrow technical solution. It's not opposing technical solutions at all costs. Technical solutions can be a remedy in some circumstances, but it's also an attempt to kind of change how we think about everything from data sets to ethics, because it's also thinking about any data set you have now does not capture any phenomena you want to model, because that phenomena or that person or that society is a moving target. So it's to encourage that your model has to always be partially open. You have to continually iterate it if you want to capture some kind of essence, for the lack of a better term. So it's a way of thinking about these issues in those directions, if that makes sense.
Thank you, Abeba. And Noopur, I want to give you a chance to respond, or we can also just turn to questions.
No, we can take questions. I feel like, I personally wanted to ask Abeba how, based on the work that she and her colleagues have done so far, if they ever end up having any thoughts that they feel could be addressed through AI and ethics education or tech and ethics education, which, as we all know, is another thing that everyone wants to do. But yeah, this is just a side question. I don't have anything to add.
Yeah, absolutely. So this latest paper called Multimodal Datasets, Rape, Pornography, and Stagnant Stereotypes, even the title is horrific. And we do put a warning because there is unpleasant blurred images and unpleasant content in there. So this paper came about. I was looking at on Twitter where they announced the release of this massive, the biggest data set to be open access. Of course, there are even massiver data sets in corporate labs, which we have no access to, which makes criticizing these people who made LAIO N400M, the name of the data set, it makes it criticizing them difficult, because in a way they have given us access into a glimpse. They have given us an access to have a glimpse of what exists in these giant corporate labs on the one hand, but on the other hand, we've seen what's inside them, and it's horrific. So when we decided the paper was rewritten in just 2 weeks. And the idea behind writing the paper was we were just looking at the data set and we don't know what to do. The data set curators, I don't want to say curators because they are not curating anything, because curating needs careful thinking and reflection. So maybe creators, the data set creators also have been contacting us. They don't know what to do. And the reason why we kind of wrote and put the paper out is because this is the kind of issue that needs awareness more than anything, that needs communication more than anything, because not only the AI community or legislators and policymakers, most people didn't know what was inside the data set. So having awareness of what's in the data set, whose images might be in the data set, and communicating this is a really crucial first step to dealing with these horrific and giant data sets that are being used, to train and validate AI systems. So communication and education is most crucial, and that was also the aim behind the latest paper.
Thank you, Abeba. We may only have time for one question here, so I'm sort of going to combine a few which have to do with governments getting more interested in regulation around some of these technologies. So there's, an example here in Canada, and also questions about the European Union sort of efforts to regulate some of these uses or even ban certain uses, such as facial recognition for surveillance purposes. Obviously, in light of the Facebook files, we've been hearing a lot more about regulation to sort of open data sets, to open access to researchers and things like that. So, in very sort of quick summary form, I'd love for each of you to weigh in on what you think the most effective potential regulatory levers might be based on your own work and experience in this field. Whoever would like, Abeba, would you like to go first?
I think I've been talking too much, so Noopur, you go first this time.
I guess 2 points. One is, and this is more from the gig economy space and the work that I've been doing before all this AI stuff, is that over there, as well as we know globally, regulating gig work and what kind of best ways to find to regulate it, because now so many people are dependent on it in terms of work, and it's also become an infrastructural thing in most of our cities, has been a burning question globally, right? And I've seen a lot of people start tying demands for regulating gig work in a certain way with older or earlier demands for labor justice, and hence sort of advancing frameworks where, if we're thinking of data justice, it's not only tied to information access or information rights or privacy and things like that, but extending those to including questions of, say, women's safety, privacy, et cetera, community-based privacy frameworks as well, are some of the progressive directions available to be able to think about regulation. And I don't quite know how this may pan out in the AI space as well, because I'm not strictly an AI policy person, or I don't think of myself as that. But I come more from the critical scholarship perspectives, and I find a lot of hope in scholarship, for instance, that has looked at and advanced ways that especially indigenous communities or marginalized communities in any context need not and must not be framed only as those who could possibly be harmed or be at risk, and hence just only be data subjects in any possible imagination of this relationship between technology and marginalized bodies. But if we, as educators, as activists, and as others, could find ways of embedding and including and giving a lot of these activists, grassroots organizers, and members of communities ways to participate in public consultations, I think that's already a huge step in terms of sort of slowing down this fast-moving train of all kinds of technologies, where before a lot of us can get on board, when you look at national AI frameworks or strategy, policy, etc. documents, the terms already seem to have been set. And if there was a way to embed either more bodies or voices to be able to slow down, unpack these terms, I think that would be a very useful thing to do.
I absolutely agree, and to add, also I'm not a policy or regulation person, but if I have to add one thing or a few things from especially having just been worked on this massive dataset, multimodal datasets recently, so with that fresh on my mind and the datasets still existing out there being used by various startups, so who knows where those models will end up. Coming just from that, I would add that, as I mentioned, on the one hand, we have to commend, the dataset creators for giving us a look into what's inside these datasets. But on the other hand, what's inside is really horrific. And if anything, there is nothing certain at the moment, and nobody knows what to do. But if we are certain of one thing, it's that we need there needs to be much more pressure onto big corporation labs that have these gigantic data sets, because these data sets and the models and the products and the tools that are built on them do not really remain in those big corporation labs. They are integrated into the world, so they do have downstream impacts directly or indirectly on society, on many people. So there needs to be much more pressure for transparency, to open access them, to open source them, so researchers and auditors can have access and can audit them. And maybe another thing is also, as we've shown in the paper, it's much easier to just create this massive data set. So there is a huge asymmetry between the ability to just create these data sets on the one hand, but on the other hand, to clean it up, to detoxify it, and to work through, various filters is a huge undertaking. So maybe there can be some kind of, some kind of criteria or some kind of pressure for anybody who wants to create it. We can't say don't create massive data sets, because it's I don't want to sound defeatist, but these data sets do exist. But what we can do maybe is pressurize to people who are creating these massive data sets to realize what they are doing has a huge consequence. And these data sets can be created in a really created and managed in a way that are, that can be equitable, that can be managed better, that can be curated in a mindful way. So some kind of, pressure, some kind of criteria, some kind of standard in that scale, for the curation process might also be something, policymakers, can work on.
Abeba and Noopur, thank you so much. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but thank you again for joining us today. I know we probably all have a new perspective on these themes now, so thank you. We look forward to continuing the conversation with you. And for those who joined us, be sure to join us again in 2 weeks. On October 25th, we'll be discussing corporate responsibility and power, and you can register via ThinkND. Thank you so much. We look forward to seeing everyone again soon.